Okay, hey folks, Mark here with the Exiles. I was going to do an internal video on cutting because we have lots of new Exiles. Despite the last year, I'm very happy to say we have lots of new Exiles, and a lot of you are starting to go back to training. It's socially distanced training, which means a lot of cutting drills, okay, because can't get close to each other. So I thought I'd do a quick video on some of the things that I normally pick up with new cutters, okay. I've just done this video, but it was really long, and I didn't want it to be that long, so I'm doing this again to try and make it much shorter. So I'm going to throw lots of things in. I haven't written a script, no particular order, but I'm going to put it on the channel because some people may find it useful, okay. So, you're joining the Exiles, you're going to be doing sword, of course you are. You're going to be doing other stuff too, which is great, but you're going to be doing just as much cutting with one hand on the weapon as you are with two hands on the weapon, and that will be made, the reasons for that were made abundantly clear to you, okay? In no particular order, one of the first things that I noticed, one of the first complaints that we have with people cutting lots with sword in one hand is how tired their hand gets, okay? Their hand starts to cramp up, which is actually just a symptom of the forearm getting tired, since that's the bit that generally is the weak link in how you would throw a sword with one hand, okay? How you would throw that thing around, okay? By far and away the most common reason for this is how tightly people are gripping the weapon, okay? And I have a little exercise for this to demonstrate to people what it is that I actually mean. So what I normally ask people to do is to stand there. I ask them to make a white fist, okay, so really strong grip with the right hand and keep it locked in as tight as you possibly can for this entire exercise, okay. With the left hand, what I ask people to do is keep it super relaxed, nice and floppy, all right. This is really important. This stays very tightly clenched, okay, because if you're gripping the weapon and you're over gripping it, you probably won't realize how tightly you're actually trying to grip that sword, okay, and it's not necessary, and we'll come on to that in a second. So with this right hand completely white, locked out, okay, really tight as you possibly can, what I get people to do is just make pirouettes, basically. Little figure of eights, lateral figure of eights, keeping this hand gripped, really strongly gripped the whole time. And what you'll find very quickly is that this forearm and this hand starts to ache, starts to tire, okay? Normally after about 15-20 seconds, okay? Reason for that, obviously, is I've got a very strong grip, okay? So my muscles are actually working against each other in the forearm, okay? And because everything's very firm and all the muscles are tensed, my blood flow isn't great, and I'm not flushing out that lactic acid, okay? What this means, how this translates into how you're holding the weapon, is there is no reason to over grip this weapon, okay? And it's something you need to check in yourself, because for most people, the temptation is to really hold onto it far too strongly, okay? What you will notice if you look around the training hall, if you are back to training, is look at the cutters who have been there for a while. Look at the members who are more advanced. You will notice a lot of them will actually keep a super relaxed grip on the weapon, okay? And quite often with sword and two hands as well, they will actually keep their hands basically completely relaxed until they need to bring the tension in. Even still, they are not over gripping the weapon, okay? It's a nice relaxed grip. Obviously you need to hold on to it. But one of the other challenges of having too tight a grip is that you're starting to lose point control. You're starting to lose dexterity, okay? So find what works for you. Having, you know, a heavier sword will obviously mean you'll need to keep a stronger grip on it, but a nice relaxed grip is what we're after. I've got hand injuries, so I tend to, visually, it looks like I've got a closed hand, but in reality, my sort of back three fingers, my lower three fingers, are quite relaxed on the weapon. I'm tending to sort of pinch the weapon. There are videos on the channel about how to hold one of these things, and what tends to happen is I'm tightening them up when I need to, okay? So quite often at the end of a cut, or when I'm expecting to impact something, or when I'm just getting it moving, that's when the grip will come in, okay? But even still, it's not a particularly firm grip, okay? I want the point control, especially with two hands on the weapon, okay, which is less obviously strenuous on just the right hand. I tend to keep quite a relaxed grip because you need that point control, okay? So relaxed hands are quick hands, okay, and they won't tire as fast. So that's number one. Number two, again, this is a very common observation with people who are new to cutting, is how much weight is being dropped onto the front foot as you start to introduce footwork into your cutting drills, which every club that's back at the moment will be doing these because we're doing socially distanced training. So I'll give you an example. So if you're cutting from posture, let's say with sword and two hands, what you will tend to find quite commonly is people are dropping all the weight onto the front foot with their first cutting action, okay? What this can do is it can compromise your structure, it can make recovery very difficult, it can be tiring on the leg, and it can make your follow-on actions very difficult as well, because you're over-committing the weight to the front foot. This is something that's you'll quite often notice if you record yourself, so in your garden or whatever, you'll record yourself, and when I do this, quite often I will film new students to show them how much weight they're putting onto the front foot. Sometimes it's right to do that, but generally speaking, you want to try and keep a good workable base. Okay, you don't want to widen your base too much. All right, so sometimes you do want to extend your cutting action. How you do that, you will obviously put weight onto the front foot, but you'll sink, okay? And you won't overcommit that weight. You won't be like this, all right? It's not that it's wrong, it's just that generally speaking, you want to be more neutral, okay? So what you ideally want to do is get into the habit of keeping a slightly more narrow base and a little bit more neutral, okay? Especially if you're doing a cutting drill, where you're going to want to put one cut straight onto the end of another cut, however you have been shown or prefer to do that, okay? Because there's a couple of different options, and we're going to talk about that in a second. This is quite prevalent really with sword in one hand, okay? As people are focusing a lot on getting the cutting angle right, moving the feet, okay? You'll tend to find that people really lean in with that initial cut, okay? So just be conscious of it. It has a time and a place, but generally speaking, keep the base a little bit narrower, and if you want to lean with the body, if you want to extend the cut, sink your weight and widen your base with the weight sunk, okay, so that you've got good structure and good recovery, rather than trying to do this or trying to kind of plonk onto the front foot like this, okay? You will, you know, over time develop methods to extend your reach, okay, but it's very common. The next one is around the accrease, okay? So the Exiles are very big on the accreasing action. You will definitely be taught to accrease with your cuts, okay? It's something that later on will be a little bit more optional, but because it's so important to accrease with some actions, we're trying to get that in right at the beginning, okay? And again, if you, whichever club you're training at, if you look around at the more advanced guys when they're mid-technique, mid-play, or just cutting and moving in general, instinctively, I promise, most of them will be doing that accreasing action with all of their cuts, okay? Because we try and build it in so that it's instinctive, all right? So, in the front foot in the direction of travel, so if I'm coming straight forward, I'm either accreasing this way, or sometimes I'm accreasing that way, or sometimes if I'm just coming from a posture, I'm just reorientating the foot, okay? But in either case, it's super important. So if we take this back to a cutting drill from our artificially, where we start artificially for our one-handed drills, we'll accrease and we'll step, okay? And again, if I'm coming forward, I'll accrease and I'll step with that second cut, okay? Because we're trying to work that habit in right from the very beginning, okay? You can crease in different directions, so sometimes you can open yourself up to cut, yeah, which makes life a lot easier. You're untangling your hips, starting to get the back leg a little bit more involved, you're squaring up your shoulders, you're making the angle easier, you're making the arm easier to engage by doing that. Sometimes you can cut across yourself, which can choke you up a little bit with your movement, and if you're cutting from that side, you're generally extending the shoulder, okay? But in either case, in the front foot direction of travel, and we'll talk about going backwards in a second, but we're here, yeah, or in some cases with some posture, yeah, we're reorientating the foot, getting that accrease type action instinctive, okay? Of course, just for clarity, since non-exiles will be watching this, you don't have to always add it in, okay? If the person's close or whatever, you're just going to cut without an accrease, whatever, but we train for perfect and we then add in the variation as and when required. Let's talk about going backwards. So I've seen some videos recently of clubs going back to training, Exiles clubs going back to training, and it's great that we have so many new people starting to join and starting to train. What I've noticed though is a wasted opportunity actually. So quite often you will get used to coming forward with our cutting drills, 1, 2, 3, 4, so on. Then what I've seen is people go backwards, start again. A little bit of a wasted opportunity, and forgive your instructors because some of the classes are quite big at the moment, so they're going to struggle to get around you all. So think of this video as cheating a little bit. You're getting ahead of the curve, but don't waste the opportunity. So we're here, let's just go backwards, okay? Everything works the same. We're backwards, reorientating backwards, reorientating reorientating yeah, Satani. Don't waste the opportunity. By my reckoning, at least 20% of the cuts you do and thrusts you do will be stepping backwards. So use that, okay? Use that opportunity. We'll come forwards and then we'll go backwards, yeah? And so on and so forth, okay? The next one is about lines of attack, especially as you start to tire out. This is a little bit more obvious with sword in two hands. People start to just drift a little bit flat with their fendentes, for example, and the Satanis are not following the same path as the fendente. These are super important, okay, because when you start adding in the plays and the mechanics to access the plays, your cutting angles become really important, okay, not just for a fence, okay, but in those instances where you need to enter a play or you need to recover from a play. So we're looking for good habits from the very, very beginning. A fendente goes teeth to knee, okay? So regardless of what posture I'm coming from, it is teeth to knee, okay? And you can, if you're training on your own or you're just doing drills in class, you can use yourself as a reference, or you can visually use someone on the other side of the hall as a reference, whatever. But the angle is really important. Again, later on we'll play around with flat fendentes and so on and so forth, but we train for perfect and we amend later. So we're fendente. On the left side, well, I'm going to talk about that recovery in a second. The easiest way to do it is just to bring the weapon up, come straight back down the line, but it's teeth to knee, okay? With Satanis, they follow the same path as a fendente, just in reverse, okay? We won't in this video talk about true and false edge too much, but for argument's sake, false edge from the left is going to follow knee to teeth, exactly the same line. This is particularly important with Satanis because if that Satani is intercepted or covered or someone breaks or beats against it, you don't have as many options as a fendente to recover from that. So the angle of a Satani is really important. It's also particularly important because generally you're using a Satani as a defensive option, okay, to beat or to come up into a mid-height cover. So the angle of a Satani is really important. It's particularly important to get the speed out of it, okay? So if I'm in Kona Longa, for example, and someone is cutting close to me, to my left shoulder, and I'm a little bit compromised with distance, I'm going to come into, for example, a posta frontale. Well, how I'm going to do that is one of my options is to use a Satani action, basically, to come up, a Satani-like action to come up into that posta frontale. Now, if my line isn't right, I'm going to be wasting time, okay? I'm going to be slowing the action down. It's going to be wide spacing. It's going to get there a little bit later, okay? So that's an example of why sometimes the line you're taking is really, really important, right? Let's take another example of Satanis because they tend to be the ones that drift away from those perfect angles the most. If we take one of the actions of Dente di Cingale, okay, let's take Mazzano, Dente di Cingale, so she stays in the middle, the weapon is in the middle. One of the actions from here, one of the easiest actions from here, is a false edge Satani at my opponent's body. The advice is to thrust with an offline movement, but it doesn't take much to imagine that I can false edge very, very quickly there at my opponent's arms, and on the end of that I can thrust, okay? Now, if my line is as it should be, knee to teeth, it's a very, very quick action, and when I get to the end of that action, I've got good structure. This is posta longa, basically. If I'm being lazy with that action, if I'm being lazy with that action and I'm just sort of throwing it up, it's not creating threat in the right way. My opponent is going to find it easier to cover against it because all they have to do is stick a sword in the way, okay? And 9 times out of 10, they're just going to be doing this instinctively. You know, it's going to have a lower success rate. So it's another example of why it's important, that knee to teeth angle now, whether it's you're coming offline with it or staying static or come offline now, why that's so important, okay? So pay particular attention to your Satanis, right? The next one is around how you're spreading your weight and where your center of gravity is, okay? Generally speaking, unless there's something going on specific or there's a particular reason for something going on with your cutting action, the shoulders should more or less stay at generally the same height, okay? As I say, there are very obvious exceptions to this with certain actions, but as a good common rule of thumb, if my shoulders are broadly staying the same height off the ground, so they can move around and so on and so forth, one can extend and one cannot, but what it generally means is that underneath my shoulders is a good base. So we've talked about base already, but a good thing to sort of bear that in mind is to think about your shoulders and where they're going, okay? What it also means though, is if I'm starting an action and I'm purposely a bit too low at the moment for my preference, if my shoulders are coming up with a strike or a thrust, what that generally means is I'm starting too low for how my body wants to move, okay? So if you're finding that your shoulders are coming up as you come out, okay, which is quite hard for me to do, but yeah, up and out. It generally means I was starting too low, okay? I was having to sort of unload my feet to start the action, okay? So for me, porta de ferro, okay, I should be able to send a cut out like this with no movement of the shoulders up and down, okay? Obviously there'll be a little bit, I'm talking about really pronounced movements. Bosh, okay? Bosh. Right, next one is a little bit around form, okay? A lot will be tidied up over time, okay? And the easiest thing to do to think about form and generation of power is not just around which parts of your body move first, so cutting with the weapon and following behind that. You'll be taught all of that right from day one. In terms of onward progression, the easiest way to start generating power is to focus on two things, okay? The first thing is the line of attack, okay? If you're following the lines of attack, as we should be, then mechanically your body will sort itself out. It may not do it on day one, but it will sort itself out. The second thing in terms of generation of power, because there's a lot of different ways to generate good power with a sword cut, okay? Some people will get that off the rotation, okay? They'll get it from the hips, they'll get it off the rotation. Some people will get it from arm speed, some people will get it from the feet. There's no one size fits all. But if your focus is just on arm speed, generally your body will sort itself out, okay? It's a bit counterintuitive because most instructors will be a lot more prescriptive on that, but we worry about that later, okay? So if I'm focusing on a fendente, just getting the line right, okay, one or two-handed, and just getting on the speed of the arms whilst maintaining discipline with that line, whilst maintaining edge alignment, okay? How my body wants to generate power and how it will develop and evolve over time will basically, it will learn itself. You'll learn yourself, okay? Your instructor might tweak things or whatever, but that's just a good rule of thumb to have. This is particularly important if you're doing solo cutting drills, okay? Don't worry about how much shoulder you're throwing forward. Don't worry too much about how you're trying to hit something hard. The force equation is mass times acceleration, okay? I think people put way too much emphasis on the mass. They're trying to really throw the body, okay? And not enough emphasis on the acceleration, the speed of the weapon. The rest will come later, okay? We'll fix that later. In terms of thrusting, okay, the important thing to remember about thrust is you can thread it from lots of different angles. Fury tells us about 5 types of thrust, okay? He doesn't give us too much detail because his manuscript serves as a reminder, of course. But the thing about thrusting is, as I say, you can throw it from lots of different angles, okay? I often group a whole bunch of thrusting actions into what I call lazy thrusts, okay? So I will, make a cover or whatever, and I'll just throw a lazy hanging thrust. It's got no distance on it, it's not got a lot of power on it. If they're armoured, it's going to do absolutely nothing. But if you're catching a sharp pointy thing in the face from, let's say, an outside cover, it's going to be enough, okay? It's going to be enough to hurt them, and it's going to be enough to follow on from. In an ideal world, starting off with, you will throw cuts mechanically a lot more sound than that, okay? So you might throw them from posta, whatever, okay? The main thing about a thrust initially is to get the point onto centre as quickly as you possibly can and get your body behind it, okay? With or without a step. So the easiest place to do this from, I'll just take a porta de ferro, okay, because for illustrative purposes it's nice and easy, but I'm just trying to get the whole thing onto centre as quickly as possible, and I'm going to follow in behind it, okay? And I'm going to push the shoulders forward. I'm not stepping, I'm going to push the shoulders forward and extend out behind the thrust. That could just as easily come in at an angle, but that's not what we're looking for to start off with. When I add the feet in, it's the same principle, okay? I'm throwing the thrust out, the body follows behind, but I'm getting it back to centre as quickly as I possibly can. So, if you're doing a cutting drill where you're working through, fendente, mezzani, and you're pulling on that thrust, well, where are you going to land? So you're going to go 1, you're going to go 2, you're going to go 3, you're going to go 4, you're going to go possibly true edge this side, you're going to drop into posta whatever, you're going to go false edge this side, and then you think about your thrusting on that drill. Get it to centre and just thrust, okay? You could thrust like this, okay? There's lots of different ways you can thrust, but again, we're training for perfect and we're amending later. So back to centre, and there your thrust comes in. So that's the other thing too. Wherever you're throwing your thrusting from as part of the cutting drills in our curriculum, get it back to centre, get your body behind it, extend the arms, so get the point out, the body will follow with or without a step, okay? And the rest of it will come a lot later. Okay, not a lot later, but it will come later. I stuttered. For the most part, that's it. Those are those initial things. So there's nothing complicated about this stuff, but it's 9 times out of 10 when you're overthinking something, that's when it becomes more of a challenge. Your brain is a wonderful tool at taking shortcuts, at making things easier, and at moving your body around underneath you. Okay, you taught yourself to walk. Okay, you will fill in the gaps yourself. Okay, so that's that. I hope it was useful, and until the next one.